Daniel 7 begins differently from any of the stories we saw before. Those were all stories about Daniel. And this one begins, I, Daniel, saw. Right? Suddenly we have Daniel as narrator of his own visions, right, as opposed to as interpreter often of other people's visions. And this is a common part of this sort of genre of apocalypse. Is, an individual has seen something that was not available to the rest of us. What he sees is this amazing and, I suppose, famous image of beasts rising from the sea. Where does this kind of imagery come from, aside from the fervid imagination of the ancient author?
Well, I think to understand a vision like Daniel 7, and this would be equally true of the book of Revelation, you have to start with the ancient myths of the ancient Near East. Mm-hmm. And in several of these, some of these are explicitly creation myths. Famous one, Enuma Elish, where Marduk, the good creator god, does battle with Tiamat, who is the monster of the deep, you might say, and eventually then cuts her in half and makes the world out of her. Yep. But also then in the Canaanite myths, which aren't maybe quite as fully developed or explicit, you have a series of battles. I mean, the basic idea is that the world is made by battle. Mm-hmm. You have these are cosmogonic myths. Yeah. It is out of these battles that you get the world as we know it. Now, one of the Canaanite myths involves a battle between Baal and Yam. Baal is well known from the Bible. He was a popular god, rival of Yahweh for the devotion of people in northern Israel especially. Mm-hmm. He was also depicted as a rider of the clouds, as Yahweh was too. Mm-hmm. And that means really a storm god, a god who brings rain and therefore gives life. Mm-hmm. And then in one of the cycles, that the deity that challenges Baal for his kingdom is the sea. Now, in a number of the passages, then you get reference to various monsters associated with the sea. Mm-hmm. One of them is called Lotan in the Ugaritic. Shows up in the Bible as Leviathan. Mm-hmm. And these monsters also show up in the poetic passages of the Hebrew Bible, mm-hmm. which shows, I think, that this imagery lived on. The Israelites, after all, were Canaanites to begin with. This was the culture that they developed.
What's remarkable is really the length of the mythic memory. Right, from potentially, with Enuma Elish, we're talking a span of nearly, if not more than 2,000 years between sort of original mythic forebears and this particular apocalyptic instantiation of the myth. They would not, I don't think, have been aware in the time of Daniel. I don't think they could have told you the story of Enuma Elish or of the Ugaritic Baal-Yam disputes. But I think it's nice to recognize that they're still dependent on that continuous use of a single story or theme, even without being aware of its history.
I can give you a nice illustration of it. Mm-hmm. At the time of the first Gulf War, there was a picture propagated by Saddam Hussein of a monster coming up out of the sea with 3 heads, one of which was Bush, another was Blair, and the third was whoever was Prime Minister of Israel at the time. And Saddam Hussein riding a white horse and carrying a lance and about to spear them. Now, I'm quite sure Saddam Hussein didn't know anything about the myths of ancient Ugarit. Mm-hmm. But this imagery had somehow or other lived on. It's cultural memory. Yeah. You don't have to have it from a specific text. Mm-hmm. A lot of scholars are very skeptical, about identifying mythic allusions like this in a book like Daniel, but it doesn't really make sense without them.
Yeah.
And you miss the whole power of it, I think, if you don't see it. Because what this dream is saying, eventually this will be explained to Daniel that the 4 beasts are 4 kings that will arise on the earth. And if Daniel said, well, why didn't I just see that in the first case?
Yeah.
Well, it wouldn't have the same effect.
That's right.
Because it's making a statement that these kings that arise on the earth are beasts coming up out of the sea, embodiments of chaos,
Yeah.
the old chaos erupting again.
Yeah.
Now, some of this imagery you can get in the Hebrew Bible, the imagery of the sea. In Isaiah chapter 27, it says that at the end, God will slay the dragon, slay Leviathan, the fleeting serpent, and he will slay the dragon that is in the sea.
Yeah.
In the book of Job, you have passages like this, and some of the Psalms. We'll find when you get into the heart of Daniel 7, there is some other imagery that is equally at home in the myths, but much harder to find in the Hebrew Bible.
Yeah, and I think we should probably talk about that because it's so unusual, and yet so obviously important. That is, part of Daniel's vision is seeing various divine figures that have what to us may appear to be not particularly transparent titles. So none of them is simply called God or Yahweh. We get titles like the Ancient of Days, right, who sits on the throne, and the one like a son of man, who is different from the Ancient of Days, it would seem. That's too many divine figures, isn't it?
This is the problem, yeah.
I mean, it's not for, it wouldn't be for Christianity, but it's actually quite problematic for ancient Judaism. What is one to make of the existence of an Ancient of Days on a throne and a divine being that is equally sort of unique and important, that is like a son of man?
I think anybody now reading the book of Daniel will recognize that the Ancient of Days is a divine figure. So, hardly anybody disputes that this is the Most High God.
Yeah.
In the old Ugaritic myths, he'd be called Yale, who equally was described with white hair as a kind of aging figure. Now, a lot of modern readers may miss the divinity of the one like a son of man riding on the clouds of heaven. But the expression one like a son of man just means somebody who looked like a human being.
And riding on the clouds of heaven sounds like a deity.
It absolutely sounds like a deity. In all of the Hebrew Bible, there are 70 or 80 occurrences. In all the other cases, it's Yahweh. And in the Ugaritic myths, it's Baal. So this creates a problem. Who is it here? Are there 2 powers in heaven? Are there 2 gods?
And if so, which one of them is Yahweh?
And
Is it
so,
the one who sits on the throne, an absolutely Yahwistic image? Is it the one who is like a son of man riding in a cloud? Also Yahweh?
Absolutely Yahwistic image. In early Israel, there is a good case to be made that at one time people distinguished between El and Yahweh. That El was the high god and Yahweh was, like Baal in the Ugaritic myths, the young god.
Yeah, Psalm 82, right? Yahweh takes his stand in the midst of the assembly of El.
Yes. Now, at some point early on, these were fused. But it looks from this that the imagery somehow lived on. Actually, Daniel Boyarin, a Jewish scholar who teaches at Berkeley, argues, though, this was a strand of ancient Jewish religion, and so there was nothing unorthodox about the Christians saying there was a second God. The only point in dispute was whether he should be identified with Jesus. But that the idea of there being a second God. I think most people would doubt that it was that widespread. There is a young scholar out teaching at the Hebrew University in Jerusalem who's writing a commentary on Daniel, who looked at this and says, well, the figure riding on the clouds, that's obviously Yahweh. And so then who is the God above him? And then he eventually kind of squirms his way back out of this and says, well, they didn't really mean it, but But actually, historically speaking, in a way, he has a point.
Yeah, and to the Boyarin argument, one does not have to have the idea be so widespread.
That's right.
It could simply be, relatively narrow, and we happen to have one manifestation of it. I think it's just very difficult often for people, especially today, to imagine such a variety of perspectives on the divine world and on the monotheism of ancient Israel. We're simply not used to that, to thinking about it in those terms.
See, monotheism isn't really the right word. The word, even in the Dead Sea Scrolls, what we translate as angels, is actually gods.
Right.
Now, it doesn't mean that they're all on a par with the Most High. You can have higher gods and lower gods, but they're gods. Any kind of being that lives forever in heaven is a god.
Yeah.
So monotheism isn't really the accurate description. Probably.
Yeah, and when I think about the Ugaritic myths with Baal, El is that sort of senior figure, but Baal is the active god, and Baal is the one that is primarily worshipped. And they seem to have no problem. I mean, we know that Baal was the main god of various cities and city-states, and they knew we were worshipping this god primarily, and there's an older guy who hangs around too.
Yeah, my analogy is the Queen of England and the Prime Minister. Which of them actually runs the country? One of them may be nominally higher, but otios, as we say.
Right.
But to come back to the one like a son of man, I think, in the book of Daniel, it's very unlikely that people were meant to see this and say, that's Yahweh. And that there have been three main lines of interpretation on this. By far, the most common one for something like 1800 years was that the one like a son of man was the Messiah. And eventually it would be interpreted that way both in Judaism and in Christianity. But there is no mention of a Messiah anywhere else in the book of Daniel. If by a Messiah you mean the one who would restore the kingdom of David. Then for a period, it was quite common to say that it's a collective symbol for the Jewish people. And that, I think, just misses the whole mythology of it. And then because now it will be clear in the vision that this one like a son of man is somehow associated with the holy ones of the Most High. The one like a son of man receives the kingdom, and then in the next round of interpretation, it's the holy ones of the Most High who receive it.
Right.
And finally, the people of the holy ones of the Most High. And these are all three dimensions of the same thing. It doesn't mean that the one like a son of man is just a symbol for the holy ones. Holy ones nearly always mean angels. And in the book of Daniel, there's several cases where they explicitly mean angels. Now, the one like a son of man, I figure, is the leader of the angelic host. He'll be identified by name later on in the book as Michael, the Prince of Israel.
Right. As we come to the last sort of few minutes here, what's the message of the vision as a whole? Because it's very complicated. It has moving parts. It has beasts. It has ancient ones. It has deities. It has angels. It has Israel. These are not transparent at all to the modern reader. That's why you're here, to tell us what this means.
It's written, first of all, for people in a time of persecution. First thing it tells you is, this is actually much worse than you think it is. You think it's just Greek soldiers or Syrian soldiers. Actually, it's beasts coming up out of the sea. It's anarchy loosed upon the world. And so, in a sense, you deepen the sense of the crisis. Right. But then, this is the beasts coming up out of the sea are part of the story. And you know that they are going to be overcome by the rider of the clouds, the figure from heaven. And this gives you a reassurance. Now, some people have written on this and say, well, if the one like a Son of Man isn't the people of Israel, then what relevance would it have for them? But the relevance it has for them is it tells them, you have a champion. There is somebody who will come to your rescue. And that gives you a whole lot more power than you would have if you were on your own.
Yeah.
So it's both the opposition is worse, but also we have heavenly resources behind us. That's what it's saying.
Good. As we move on in the book, we will encounter more of this kind of imagery that will need more explanation, I'm afraid.